So the book we are starting with is Beyond Resistance, The Institutional Church Meets the Postmodern World by John Dorhauer. And why we picked this book is it was recommended by Kelly Gallagher, the Associate Conference Minister of Central Mass United Church of Christ. And Kelly had come to GPC last October 20th and met with the governing board or members of the governing board and had recommended this book in terms of getting us started for our search for our pastoral search committee, which hadn't formed yet. And it's a short book, but it really has some mind-provoking questions and some thought process. And I'll share the back. So first, let me tell you who the author is. Reverend Dr. John Dorhauer is the General Minister and President of the United Church of Christ. After growing up Roman Catholic in St. Louis and spending 8 years in Catholic seminary, he earned his master's in divinity from Eden Theological Seminary and was ordained in 1988 as a Protestant minister. John served 16 years in 2 local churches and 12 years on 2 conference staffs. His ministry is at both the local church and judiciary levels have given him a unique perspective from which to view the great transformation that is coming. So that's his little bio. And the quick synopsis says, Beyond Resistance is a template for those devoted to the idea that faith should be just, generous, and inspire commitment to the common good. The rise of postmodernity and its influence on the expression of faith are not the cause of religion's perceived diminishment in capacity, relevance, and impact. That's a big sentence. To the contrary, both the institutional church and those who hold faith in a postmodern key can and should be allies in a common cause. What is unfolding is nothing short of a second Reformation. And this Reformation, unlike the previous one, can unite both the change agents and the changing institution as partners on the same playing field. So, Lynn and Janet, did you have any questions just in terms of this book as a launch for a conversation?
No,
No? Okay.
No, it sounds as though it's going to give us some insight as perhaps some of the sticking points for some of the mindsets, and that's what I look forward to hearing about. I don't have any questions, but it really sounds like it might fit that bill.
Okay. So chapter 1 is entitled Death with Dignity. I'm not afraid of death. I just don't want to be there when it happens, says Woody Allen. Let's be honest. Churches are dying. Well, some of them are. Many more are going to. The combination of membership losses, the rising costs of maintaining budgetary expenses that include full-time clergy, large pieces of aging property, and a steep decline in the economy have placed many of our churches in very precarious times. I want to examine some of the causes of this diminishment and vitality and talk about some of the responses to it that church leaders should be considering. David Greenhaw, president of Eden Seminary, spoke 2 years ago at a Phoenix area church. He reported that for every year of this country's life, the church in America grew a minimum of 1% a year without exception until 1961. Since that time, and again without exception, the church has declined in membership a minimum of 1% a year. Fundamentalists have argued that the church has become too liberal. It is an apostate church. God has condemned this church to inevitable decline because of its unwillingness to follow Scripture to the letter of the law. This argument lost steam when, in the last decade, many of the large fundamentalist megachurches started bleeding members, and it began to dawn on everyone that significant membership losses happened without regard to theological orientation. The truth about these losses is far more complex. It is not the purpose of this book to write about the causes of this decline, nor about the inevitability that some churches won't survive. I feel it is still important that I mention 3 things that are having a deep impact on church decline: birth rates, the cost of maintaining aging property, and postmodernity have all significantly changed the landscape of the church. I'm being a bit selective here. Others will look to different causes, and they would be right to do so. Again, what we are experiencing in the church today is the result of a complex array of issues that defies simple explanation. What I offer here is admittedly biased and incomplete. The next passage is birth rate. An often overlooked factor is perhaps the simplest one of all, birth rates. Let's look at some numbers. In 1910, the birth rate, the number of live births per 1,000 in population in the United States was 30.1. In 2010, it was 13.4. Over the last 100 years, the birth rate has dropped almost a full 20 per 1,000. There was not a decade in those 100 years when the birth rate did not drop. In June of 2013, the Washington Times reported that the fertility rate, the number of children per woman in America, dropped to 1.89%, well below the replacement level of 2.1%, the rate at which our current population base can sustain or replace itself. We talk about the shift in America from an agrarian to an urban culture, the shift from the Industrial Revolution to the information age, the sexual revolution, pharmaceuticals that help women control unwanted pregnancies, better sex education, and even the impact of climate control on population rate. All are critical factors that affect how the culture in general and how individual women in particular approach decisions about childbirth. We cannot, however, escape the simple fact that America, for a long time, was building more and more churches to sustain an ever-growing population. We built them because we needed them. Most churches hit their peak in membership sometime in the 2 decades following the Second World War. We call the children of those war brides the baby boomer generation. Because of those large families, church membership grew. And as white flight led to the abandonment of the city and middle-class families moved to the suburbs, more and more new churches were required to meet the needs of shifting populations. Many of those churches even built day schools so that working families had somewhere safe to take their children during the week. It should come as no surprise that this final year of baby boomer births would also be the last year that American churchgoers saw their membership numbers grow. There can be little doubt that we don't need as many churches today. Supply has outstripped demand. It is inevitable that some of our churches are going to close. I listen to pastors from previous generations describe an "if you build it, they will come" phenomenon. Those days are gone. I don't want to imply that it is as simple as this, but we have to consider whether some of the churches that were built to sustain the population base that grew in the aftermath of World War II are simply no longer viable due to the steep decline in birth rates. For at least the last 20 years, church growth has not been about meeting the demands of a growing population, and certainly not about creating more and more space for all those new believers who are demanding that we build more churches to meet their ever-growing needs. Denominations are finding that those old methods no longer work. The next section is entitled Property. Closely related to birth rate is the cost of maintaining aging properties, especially when many of the buildings erected to house worshipers sit largely empty most Sundays. It is assumed that to be a church, you have to have your own property. This makes sense. I don't want to create the impression that by naming property as a contributing to cause of decline, I am saying that a church should not own property. What I do mean to suggest is that property must serve a missional purpose. Too many churches hold on to buildings long after there is no identifiable mission. There can be no doubt that once this happens, the amount of resources needed to maintain them becomes a serious drain on missional resources. Few churches that I know ever ask questions about the legitimacy of maintaining their property, even after their membership base has shrunk to a size no longer sufficient to justify or support it. Churches are called into being by the Holy Spirit in order to undertake mission. Of all the work I do as an agent of the wider church, I think the most important is reminding our church leaders that everything they do is in service to a mission. One of my mantras is simply, it's about mission. Identifying that core mission and giving your heart and soul to it with passion, commitment, and excellence is a critical component to maintaining health and viability. But as we approach what Phyllis Tickle calls the church's next rummage sale, We have an obligation to take a serious look at what we keep. If what we hold on to does not contribute to a mission that we know we must complete, it may be important for the sake of that mission to let it go. Staying attached to a past way of being that no longer serves a mission turns churches into museums. It is my experience that for many of our churches, maintaining buildings has become the mission. Long after they have lost the ability to fill to capacity the sanctuaries in which they worship, they continue to spend missional resources to maintain large, empty, unused spaces. There is a level of devotional and emotional commitment to these properties, some of which long ago stopped meeting a need. Let there be no doubt about the beauty of these sanctuaries. Often very poor immigrants felt a duty-bound call to honor Christ by giving hard-earned and much-needed family income to the church so that worshipers could be inspired. The buildings they left behind are testimonies to their commitment to honoring God. It wasn't just love and pride that compelled them to sacrifice so much in the effort. It was also a commitment to the gospel and a desire to leave behind a legacy that would establish the faith for many generations to come. Let there be no doubt about their historical value. Generations of children have been baptized, confirmed, married, and buried inside these sacred walls. Pastors, often unbeknownst to them, have uttered words in sermons that changed lives forever. Town hall meetings, community rallies, protest marches, and congregational meetings have taken place in them, some of which have altered the course of history. Let there be no doubt about the good that took place inside these buildings down through the years. Untold millions have come to the doors of these buildings knowing that they would find comfort and solace. Hard luck families needing a little more than a meal or a bus ticket to the next town have knocked on doors knowing that a kind face would greet them. Men and women overcome by life's tensions and or their choices have wandered into these sanctuaries hoping to hear a word of comfort, direction, or forgiveness. Let there be no doubt that for many of our churches, these buildings still serve an important and essential mission. In some communities, groups like Alcoholics Anonymous and Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays discover that churches are one of the very few safe places where they can gather without fear of recrimination. Many churches are now using their vast spaces to shelter homeless families on a rotational schedule with other churches in their community. Food pantries and clothes closets are often warehoused in churches. English as a second language classes, after-school programs, computer labs, and daycare centers are often found in our churches. There is no limit to what creative minds with a heart for mission can do with the space they control. Having said that, it is still the case that for many of our churches, the property has become an anchor weighing them down. Sanctuaries, classrooms, and fellowship halls sit empty through the week. The days of Sunday morning worship filled to capacity are a part of the distant past. Upkeep on buildings must be maintained even if there is no income drawn off of it, and even if parts of the building are of no real value to the church and its ongoing mission. With every dollar we spend on space that serves little to no missional purpose, our collective capacity to undertake the full mission of the church is compromised. In May of 2010, I went to visit one of the churches in my conference. At their invitation, I was to spend the day with them thinking about how to renew their vitality. They were a dying church with a shrinking budget and a very small membership. The first thing they did was hand me their budget. I noticed that they had two large expenditures, each of which took up roughly half the budget. One was the cost of the pastor, the other was the cost of the property. The very next thing I saw was that every Sunday they collected exactly half of what they needed to sustain their budget. They were 3 months in arrears paying their pastor and were trying hard to get a bank to loan them money to see them through the shortfall. No bank was willing. After about 10 minutes of quietly reading through their finances, I said to them, "This isn't rocket science, folks. You can afford your pastor or the building, but you can't have both. You have to figure out a way to be a church with a pastor or not a building, or figure out how to be church with a building, but not a pastor." In January of 2012, I spent a Sunday morning in an urban church that owned almost a city block of property. About a dozen people attended worship. Worship that Sunday morning was meaningful and deeply spiritual. I was moved by the experience. I could see why those dozen or so did what they did and why they kept coming back. I also know they had spent the last few years agonizing over how to steward the last of their vast resources, paying for their full-time pastor and their property. I met with them 2 nights later and told them how moved I was to be part of their worship. I told them how important it was for them never to lose that, to hold on to that community for as long as they could. I then told them they could continue to do that every Sunday in a room the size of a classroom we were sitting in. They didn't need that large sanctuary, much less the rest of the classrooms, offices, and other outlying buildings. I observed they were exhausting themselves by trying to figure out how to pay for all of it. I even risked sharing with them that as a church, their mandate was mission. As a representative of the larger church, I tried to help them see that the missional resources they were stewarding belonged not to them, but to the body of Christ. If they continued to steward those vast missional resources with no clear missional purpose, the body of Christ as we know it was being deprived of the resources it had a right to claim for the sake of its mission. 2 other churches in the Southwest Conference voted this year to sell their buildings. They are looking for ways to live out their mission without an attachment to property. In one church, a group has split from its original congregation when it became clear to them that, if not the building itself, at least the very location of the building, 6 miles outside of a small New Mexico town, a location that drew no new members there, was hindering their vision for proclaiming a gospel of extravagant welcome that they knew would help grow the church. Citing that the Spirit was calling them to do something new, some members have begun to reshape this call to the church without commitments to any property that they own. These are not exceptions. These are examples of an ever-growing pool of churches whose property is seen by them to be consuming missional resources without any clear missional purpose or value, or even worse, seen as a clear hindrance to their missional purpose. If all we do as a church is count the bodies in our sanctuaries on Sunday morning and subtract that number from the total seating capacity of those sanctuaries, we would get a collective picture of how over-propertied we are. This is a hard one to figure out. Erecting buildings is hard and costly. The investment needed for a worshiping body to meet its need is immense. And there was a time when we had to build more and more sanctuaries, or expand ones we had already built, and at considerable expense. Our experience was that we couldn't build them fast enough. We would finish one and it was full. Another one was needed. But that's just not the case anymore in a post-baby boomer world. Very few of our sanctuaries are anywhere near full. Too much has happened in those spaces for people to let go of them easily. Communities are attached to them. It is going to be hard and painful to dissolve. Merging 2 churches in order to save space and money will be an unsavory prospect. And in denominations like the UCC, which have a congregational polity and where churches are fully autonomous, finding the leverage needed to persuade them to sell their property will not be easy. And yet our buildings are killing us. Okay, not all of them, but enough of them. We have to take a serious and collective look at this. This has to be on the table for discussion as we move forward as the church. We have to develop a new narrative built around the centrality of mission, subjecting everything else to it. Buildings must serve a clear missional purpose and must be funded and maintained in a way that mission is not sacrificed or impeded. You don't start that conversation by asking how much meaningful mission can we get by with and still keep the building. You start that conversation by knowing with passion what your mission is, and then objectively, at times heartlessly, asking whether or not the building will fulfill, enhance, or impede that mission. If the building is an impediment for the sake of the mission, it may be important to free yourself from it and find a more creative way to be church and to fund your mission. Some churches are doing just that. Without a collective will to engage critical church leaders in a broader conversation about this, I feel that underutilized property attached to churches in decline will continue to compromise our future health and vitality. The third part of this chapter is postmodernity. If there is not enough good research on population shifts in America and their overall impact on church growth and sustainability, the same cannot be argued about what is a third critical factor contributing to church decline. It has to do with change. Population studies are about numbers. Postmodernity is about culture, change within it, and it's an organization's ability to cope with that. There are thousands of good books, articles, blog sites, websites, magazines, and videos already produced about postmoderns and how they are changing what we once knew about church. Among the most influential authors on this subject are Phyllis Tickle, Rob Bell, Anthony Robinson, Peter Rollins, Brian McLaren, Nadia Bowles-Weaver, and so many others. It is not my intention to argue about the impact that postmodernity is having on the church. It is not my intention to write in great detail about what kind of impact it is having on the church. I myself rely on others to do that for me, as I'm sure many of you do as well. I do, however, want to highlight some of what I have learned about this cultural shift and make some observations about how the shift is contributing, not just to church decline, but to the much harder reality to cope with, that some of our churches are going to die because of it. I'm going to narrow my focus here to 3 statements about postmoderns. I want to look closely at what they reveal about shifts in expectations regarding what it means to be a person of faith. There could, of course, be many more statements made about that. These are illustrative of the point I want to make, which is that change is coming fast and is of such a substantive difference that some churches are going to die and others are going to have to be built anew to replace them. Not only have we saturated the market for a population base that isn't growing anymore, not only are we compromising our missional output by pouring dollars into properties that don't serve our mission, but a whole new worldview is emerging that makes much of what the Church of Modernity was built to do obsolete. These statements I am using suggest that the change that is called for is not just at the level of replacing something stale with something fresh, wondering what the cost will be and whether or not we can afford it. It is also not about whether or not we want to make that change. Therefore, I am not going to write about things like whether or not a church should replace their organ with electric guitars, whether or not the pastor should wear a robe, whether the pastor should preach from the pulpit, whether or not we should replace bulletins with big screens, whether or not we should add a contemporary service. Those are changes at the technical level that completely miss the point. I'm looking at what makes for a paradigm shift, the kind of change that requires whole new ways of thinking about what we do, for whom we do it, and why we do it. I'm thinking about what leadership studies call adaptive changes. I'm going to pause for a minute before I get into his statements. What are you thinking so far? Any reflections?
It resonates.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Right on.
Yeah. It's all the stuff we've been talking about, hasn't it?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Well, let me keep persevering. There's a couple more pages in this section. So, statement 1. Postmoderns do not believe that there is such a thing as universal truth. In other words, what is true for you may or may not be true for me. This simple statement is a game changer for the church. We have not even begun to wrap our heads and hearts around how deeply the church, as it has been known for 2 millennia, now has invested in the notion that there are universal truths. Postmodernity doubts, if not outright denies, this. Whether it is a fact or not that there are no universal truths is irrelevant. Well, of course it's relevant. But in this chapter about why some churches are going to die, that argument is moot. It's moot because 2 facts subsist side by side. Postmoderns don't believe universal truths apply. Many churches don't know how to teach or preach in the ambiguity that permeates a world with no universal truths. For simplicity's sake, let's look at only one aspect of the Church of Modernity, the role of clergy in the life of the institutional church. I made a bold statement to the annual meeting delegates of the Southwest Conference 3 years ago at the Church of the Red Rocks in Sedona, Arizona. I said that in many of our churches, full-time, seminary-trained, ordained clergy were already an impediment to the missional life of the church. That statement suggests 2 very different things. It suggests that for many of our churches, the cost of maintaining a salary for these clergy is so prohibitive that they sacrifice their missional calling in order to keep paying a full-time pastor's salary. The smallest congregation I know of that pays a full-time pastor has around 25 members. I intend to imply that there are churches that ignore their missional calling without looking with a critical eye at how paying a full-time pastor, the average cost of which now exceeds $85,000, and for whom health care alone is close to $20,000, affects what mission they can actually undertake. This contributes to the ever-growing phenomenon that all that pastors are asked to undertake as their mission is to meet their congregants' needs. Let's put aside the financial argument. When I talk about clergy being a missional impediment, I suggest something far more subtle than churches that can't afford the price tag of full-time clergy are sacrificing some of their missional calling by spending beyond their means to keep a pastor. I also mean to suggest that what we have trained clergy to do and be is not what those whom are trying to attract a church expect a pastor to be. That may even be an understatement. It may well be the case that the role of clergy, however it may come to be defined itself, is something that postmoderns aren't asking for in order to sustain their faith. Clergy are well-trained, well-equipped, and well-prepared to lead a church. With each passing year, that postmodern culture isn't producing enough followers who are asking for what they have been trained, equipped, and prepared to offer. The Church of Modernity upholds fundamental truths about theology, about morality, about lifestyle choices, about liturgical and ritual practices, about scripture, about sacraments. It invests in educating those who articulate and defend a call to ministry as a means of propagating and preserving those truths and standards from one generation to another. It prepares clergy to know full well what those truths and standards are. It examines them very carefully and renders judgment about their fitness for ministry in and on its behalf. It tests whether they have the capacity to sustain those fundamental truths. It has to know whether someone authorized for ministry will or will not be a threat to its historic, traditional teachings, practices, and standards. It gives them a pulpit each week from which they speak as a trained expert on what they have learned or about what God has inspired them to say. And it provides them every week with a passive audience to absorb that teaching. This is not an argument for or against the merits of this model of being church. It is simply an observation that as long as we invest in educating, training, and paying experts to speak on behalf of the church, and in the speaking deploy them to maintain an established orthodoxy, we will have lost the postmoderns. In this changing environment that postmodernity is birthing, the role of clergy as trained professional, authorized expert who speaks with the permission of and under the watchful eye of the mother church could become an impediment to the overall mission of the church. This is a good time to point out that we are not talking here about a generation gap. This is not about asking, what does this generation want and what can we do to accommodate them? Postmodernity is a movement that is expected to last as long as the age of modernity or enlightenment did, about 500 years. What's at stake here is not finding out how to get teenagers back into church. This is a question about what we can do to prevent moving from talk about some churches dying to talk about the church dying. That postmoderns do not buy into the notion of universal truth has a couple of important consequences. The first is that they are simply not going to invest in a model of the church that asks an expert with the answers to talk to them while they remain passive. Postmoderns come into every encounter with others believing that each person in the room has life experience that makes them wise. They want to know what those experiences have taught them and expect that their own experiences will be valued in the conversation. They believe that only in a community that ritualizes open dialogue can we discover new truths. Architecture, liturgy, and ecclesiology that rely on the trained expert in the room to establish truth and morality will not capture their attention. Such a church will no longer be the church of their heart. One final note here. I don't want to go too far into writing an apologetic for postmoderns and their way of thinking. I really only want us to understand what are some of the elements of this paradigm shift so that we can begin to wrap our heads around why so much feels different to us. Having said that, I will point out that one of the observations made by postmoderns is that too much of what we now accept as truth is the byproduct of white heterosexual males having almost exclusive control over determining, defining, and establishing for everyone else what will be accepted as truth. We should not be surprised that others have different ideas. Women raised in a world that viewed them as everything from inferior beings to nothing more than the legal property of their male head of household will have different perspectives on truth. It should not surprise us that one's sexual orientation can affect one's relationship with moral judgments made exclusively through the lens lenses of heterosexual males. It should not surprise us that those who are not white, many of whom lived through slavery and genocide at the hands of the white man, also construct different worldviews with different relationships to what has been established as universally true for all. In the age of postmodernity, the filters of race, gender, sexual identity, culture, class, and income level all matter. In the end, this may not be an argument so much about there not being universal truths applied across the board for all people throughout all of the time. It may be much simpler than that. It is their observation that human intellect cannot escape the impact that race, gender, and other factors play in impeding the ability to recognize and articulate these universal truths without error. My relationship to truth will always be negotiated through lenses and filters, the impacts of which I cannot escape. Wow, that was a powerful statement. Any thoughts?
Powerful chapter.
Yeah, very much so.
I said, wow.
Yeah.
And yet I think about some of the younger people that I know, or even some of the people at our age that have adopted this, there is no one truth. And I believe that myself. While what we practice might to me be truth, it's my bias. And sometimes my bias gets in the way.
Right.
Because, and yet it doesn't mean that I don't love people that believe other truths, for example, because I do. But it explains a lot about, I guess, how we've put together our structure to center around that. And yeah, it's not going to attract, for example, somebody in postmodernity that may not escape it, but believes that the platform is really much greater than that.
Right. Yeah.
It's pretty powerful.
So let me keep going. He has, that was statement one. He has 3 statements. Statement 2, postmoderns learn differently. In the last 2 generations, there has been an important epistemological shift. Wow, that's a mouthful. This is not an argument that they learn better. They just learn differently. This is not something they chose to do or choose not to do, but is the byproduct of technological developments that impact the brain and how it processes stimuli. It is really important as we begin this discussion to realize that this is not a matter of choice. No child raised in postmodernity said, I think that the way my parents and grandparents learned is outmoded. Sit me in front of a computer, TV, laptop, notebook, gaming device, and smartphone, and condition my brain to learn differently. And yet, that is exactly what parents have done to their children for the last 2 generations. I don't make any judgments about that. I only take note of what others are now noticing about how the brain is affected by that, and then how that impacts the culture at large, and the church more particularly. In his 1985 work, Amusing Ourselves to Death, Neil Postman writes about a different intelligence capacity required by the print medium as opposed to film or television. He refers to Marshall McLuhan's oft-quoted phrase, the medium is the message, and proffers instead this adage, the medium is the metaphor. Born in 1931, Postman represented the first generation to spend its childhood in front of a television. His landmark book was an attempt to understand just what television had done, not just to entertain us, but also to condition us as a culture to learn differently. He noted that by the time the average child began her elementary school education, she had already spent more time in front of a TV than she would spend in the classroom by the time she graduated high school. He wrote about what the patterns endemic to the standard television program did to condition the brain to process outside stimuli. Those processes would have a profound effect on how a child learns. These are averages, more close approximations than exact figures, but you will get the point. Every 3 seconds or so, the image on the TV screen changes. Every 2 minutes, give or take, the scene changes. Every 7.5 minutes, the program takes a break. And over the next 3.5 minutes, nothing relative to the plot development occurs. In essence, a whole new narrative develops and is completed in 30-second increments throughout those 3.5 minutes. Then we return to the plot until another 7 or 8 minutes goes by, and we repeat the pattern of 30-second interruptions. The entire plot narrative plays out in 30 to 60 minutes. There is drama, there is conflict, there is tension, and there is resolution. Now take that same child who for 6 years has been sitting either passively in front of that ever-changing screen and set them in a classroom for 8 hours a day where the scene doesn't change and one voice speaks minute after minute after minute. They get bored easily. The brain has been conditioned to process stimuli in one way. It is used to an almost constantly changing scene. It expects some drama, some conflict, some resolution, entertainment, shall we say. It has also been wired to learn differently. Under these new circumstances, it might learn something, but not nearly enough of what we had come to expect from students raised under a very different set of circumstances. The very first time I heard the phrase paradigm shift was in 1990. I was attending a seminar for school teachers. They were all being introduced to a whole new educational model. These were men and women who had been trained as professionals. They were very good at what they did. In spite of being very good at it, they noticed with some frustration that what they were doing wasn't working. The superintendent of the school district invited me to take part in the training. While there, one message came through very clearly. We don't learn the way we used to. You are not going to like this, but whole new methods of learning and of teaching are going to have to be developed. Your own education, which prepared you to be a teacher, a job you've been performing well for all these years, is of very little use to you. If our mission is education and the old ways aren't educating, then new ways, a whole new paradigm must emerge. That was the first time I heard leaders talk about paradigm shifts. That was the first time I had to wrap my head around that difference between technical shifts and adaptive changes. That was the first time I realized that we were not talking anymore about subtle changes, but substantive ones that were going to be very hard to make. Educational systems have worked hard to make those changes. The church has not. That day was an epiphany to me. In the 23 years that have followed, I have pursued at varying degrees of success the call to transform the church as we know it. There is a gospel to be proclaimed, for sure. How do we do that if our methods of proclaiming it aren't communicating effectively? What does it mean when the medium, not the message, must change? Clearly, clergy who think that a 30 to 45-minute monologue is our most effective way of teaching are deluding themselves. Folk are listening, but they aren't necessarily learning. Typically, our brains are checking in and out every couple of minutes or so. Those who can focus with intention and discipline will stay in the game longer than others. But our brains aren't conditioned to learn anymore by listening to one voice, watching one face, and following one train of thought for much longer than a few minutes. We take our own breaks during these monologues, wander around for a while, and then come back. Sometimes the break is only a few seconds. Sometimes it's a few minutes later. Sometimes they don't come back at all. This happens now for even those most invested in the life of the church. For countless others, this modality of being church is not something they have a willingness to invest in anymore. It simply doesn't meet their needs. This is not a rejection of the church as church. This is not a denial of the value of a life well lived, enhanced by meaningful encounters with the sacred, and shaped by like-minded people living in a committed community of faith with one another. It is simply the experience of coming to church, wanting to have a meaningful encounter, and walking out understimulated, bored, and having learned little to nothing. This single epistemological shift, a direct result of sitting children in front of the television, the computer, the notebook, the smartphone, is a game changer. Schools are adapting, but by and large, churches are not. This is not a judgment about one way of being better than the other. Children aren't stupid. They learn differently, but they learn. They adapt. They meet the needs of a changing world. Almost everywhere they go, they find the world a curious, inviting, and interesting place that has changed with them until they get to church. I spend much of my time listening to pastors and lay leaders who love their churches. Their lives have been transformed by their experiences there. They are willing to sacrifice a great deal to help make that happen for others. One of their familiar refrains, born largely from the grief of seeing a beloved church in decline, is that megachurches, evangelicals, and fundamentalists attract so many because all they do is entertain. This refrain misses the point. It also fails to notice that the decline we are experiencing is having as deep an impact on all churches birthed in the age of modernity, regardless of their theological or ecclesiological background. The point is that brains are wired a bit differently today than they were 2 or 3 generations ago. Others are adapting to this because they recognize that their mission can be achieved regardless of the medium. The church all too often confuses the medium with the message. It assumes that abandoning centuries-old liturgical practices for the sake of modern expediencies is tantamount to dumbing down the gospel. Whether you use a 30-minute sermon or a well-produced 15-minute video, if the message is well-crafted, you have the potential to produce the same end result. I don't mean to suggest that churches need to invest in big screens, rock bands, noise, or entertainment quality Christianity. What I do mean to suggest is that a stubborn, self-righteous insistence that our medium is as sacred as our message is one of the factors contributing to our demise. And in some instances, an unwillingness to ask deeper questions about how to translate messages with new media will be revealed in the postmortems of some of our once vital and healthy churches. In essence, and with some notable exceptions, progressive Christianity has ceded relevant Christianity to our more fundamentalist conservative partners in faith who don't have any issues with using a variety of media to proclaim their message. The noise may attract for a while, but even postmoderns who find the theology of most megachurches too narrow are walking away. We simply aren't yet giving them a choice to hear our message proclaimed in a way that they have been conditioned to receive it. Cameron Thrimble, executive director of the Center of Progressive Christianity, puts it this way. While Christian churches are less flexible with their theology, they are incredibly adaptable when it comes to their ritual and liturgy. Progressive Christianity, on the other hand, has a very flexible theology, but refuses to change its ritual and the liturgy. We learn differently today. Old forms no longer serve as well as they once did. The longer the church I love fails to adapt wisely to these changes, and we are already at least one generation late to the game, the more of our churches are going to die. I do grieve this, though perhaps not with the intensity of some others I know. I do not want the grief over these deaths to disable the church I love from making the important and necessary changes required to remain relevant for the sake of our mission and our message. That was statement 2. Any thoughts?
Should be required reading.
Yes, it should be required reading for all of everybody at our church.
This is
Funny thing about it is that I believe that in our community, although it would require a change of mindset on how we're doing things now, we have that ability to entertain.
Sure.
We have some very gifted people that know how to do different types of artistic kinds of things and different kinds of like physical activities. And like the food preparation alone for our hunger ministries, I could easily see, for example, a Sunday morning transformation of the worship experience becoming one of real service. For example, say we've got the equipment already too, because we put up the widescreen, so I could see the video of like centering a particular, say, project for the day.
Right.
Whether it be, or several projects for the day that might center around one particular gospel reading and commentary about that. And then people like going to their separate corners and doing stuff and being the church. Exactly.
Right.
Programs more than this liturgical kind of like, again, that may not be the universal truth to the postmodern, but one thing that is universal is that they care about the people in the community that are hungry. They care about them and their families remaining fit to move around in the world.
Right.
And you know, like for the people that might do some crafts, some people have a real artistic bend. Look at our prayer shawl ministry, for example.
Oh, absolutely.
We could take that activity of the prayer shawl ministry and transform it into something that's program oriented on a Sunday morning that's based upon a particular gospel reading.
Yeah.
Then again, do we need the real estate to do it?
Probably not.
Probably not. Yeah.
Probably not.
I have to excuse myself at this point.
Sure.
I don't know if you want to keep going or if you wanted to.
Do you want me to keep going, Janet? There's one more piece, statement 3. It only has,
I'll but I'm very interested.
I'll wait for statement 3 and then I'm
Okay.
going to cut out.
and
Okay.
that's the end of the chapter. That's it brings me.
Okay, great.
I'm gonna plow on.
Maybe by the next time I'll have my book and I can take over the reading for you. Has your
Sure.
throat parched yet?
No, but I find it fascinating. I mean, I kind of skimmed it when I first received the book, and I was like, I understand why Kelly Gallagher recommended it, because this is where we are. And I think it's so not just relevant, it's, as Janet just said, it should be required reading of all of the church body that are making decisions about the congregation.
But you know, I'm of the age that I have lived this. Church has always been in my life. And I was born in 34. So I've been through all the rise and decline. I now am in, this whole new generational thing. A lot of people my age are not ready for this. I see it all the time. I feel that I think it's needed, but to convince people in my age group, it's not going to be easy.
No, that's a hard truth, I think. Anyway, statement 3, postmoderns do not trust institutional authority. One of the lessons my father relied heavily upon in raising me was to trust authority. It came out in aphorisms like, trust your elders, respect adults, don't question the church. Whether you like it or not, do what you're told by those in power. By the time I reached adulthood, it was clear to me that to succeed in my dad's world, an unquestioning submission to authority was a given. I couldn't bring myself to pass those lessons on to my children. In fact, I told them to question everything and everyone, regardless of their status, power, or position. There's a big shift in attitude, orientation, and perception. I spent 8 years in the Catholic seminary. From whatever age it is that a child begins to think about her future, I knew I was called to be a priest. I remember sitting in the classroom of my Catholic grade school when the parish priest came in to talk about vocation. He asked if any of us had ever thought about serving the church. It was the first time I had ever given a chance to name publicly what I had known in my heart for a long time. I immediately and enthusiastically raised my hand. Though I was surprised by the responses of my classmates, my teacher, and even to a certain extent the priest, let's just say I wasn't the most well-behaved student, I was not in any way deterred from pursuing what I felt was a call to the priesthood. This isn't a story about my vocational pathway, but about what happened to me after grade school. I spent 8 years in seminary preparing for the priesthood. Against the advice of my father, I started questioning everything and everyone. There was no calculation in this for me. This was not a generational rebellion. This was not a conscious effort to eschew the ways of my father and define myself in my own terms. It was an intellectual curiosity. It was a pursuit of deeper knowledge. It was an effort prior to ordination to know why I was being asked to believe what the church was teaching me. That was in part for my own sake, but also for the sake of those to whom, upon ordination, I would be entitled to dictate what they could and could not believe. I would soon learn that I walked in what was the church and the world of my father. My worldview was already different than the one I now lived in. In this old paradigm, there was no questions. Authority spoke, and when it did, the matter was settled. Invariably, I got the same response to every question. John, these are the teachings of the church. They have been this way for 2,000 years. Who are you to question them? That led, after 8 years, to a heartbreaking decision not to seek ordination as a Catholic priest. I decided that I could not, with any kind of integrity, have hands laid upon me by the same bishop who would now require of me a vow of obedience. Once I took that vow, I was obligated to require others to believe what he asked, knowing that I didn't yet fully believe it. My story is not an unfamiliar one. I am a boomer who learned that it was not only permissible to question authority, it was a cultural requirement and expectation. Boomers came of age in the aftermath of significant global upheaval. World War II saw an overt attempt to wipe out a significant part of the human community. Over 6 million Jews were annihilated in the genocide. They gave us all new insight into our capacity for sustaining evil. In a single moment, little boy was dropped off the Enola Gay over Hiroshima, and seconds later, 70,000 people were dead. Almost every morning of my childhood, I watched a war unfold in Southeast Asia. I saw dead and maimed bodies. I also listened to the rhetoric of a nation that could no longer articulate a narrative that made sense of the bloody mess we were watching. To the contrary, the voices I came to respect were calling into question everything that America thought it stood for. At the same time, I saw 2 Kennedys and a king assassinated while bigots and racists turned firehouses and attack dogs on my neighbors. As I left my childhood years and entered my teens, I watched my president resign in shame. I sat glued to the TV day after day watching Sam Ervin interrogate Mitchell, Dean, Liddy, Hunt, and everyone else who conspired to end democracy as we knew it. There was no moment of epiphany. I never sat down and said, time to question authority. I just absorbed the world around me. Everything would be questioned. By that time, I fashioned myself a bit of a rebel. Question authority had become my motto. My heroes were the rebels, including all of the great prophets from our canon, whose work stung the powerful elite of their time. I saw judiciary work as compliance with power structures against which I had now committed myself to fight. By the time of my ordination, I was a byproduct not of a generational shift, but of a paradigm shift I had no deep capacity to yet fully understand. That's a way of saying that the middle to the end of the 20th century will be marked as a turning point in history. Among the many things that have shifted in the age of postmodernity is a posture towards authority and institution. We have built a model of church that has sustained the gospel well and served the needs of its mission well. Buttressed by clearly delineated lines of authority and power, the church has maintained a level of excellence for which it should be proud. I know of horrors committed throughout the ages by the abuse of power and authority. That is another subject for another time. The world has shifted a bit, and the schism that is postmodernity, we sit on the other side of the shift and realize that postmoderns don't orient the same way towards authority. I actually think this is going to be the hardest change with which the church must cope. Everything about our way of being assumes that authority is identified, prepared, examined, and empowered. Bylaws tell us who can act on another's behalf and under what circumstances. They grant power and authority to some people for some time under some circumstances. Committees are duly elected, processes, prepare, study, examine, vote, and determine. Clergy are called, educated, examined, and authorized. Bishop, conference ministers, presbyters, elders, deacons, regional ministers, and authority figures of all kinds preside over defined geographies. Ordination requires a comprehensive examination by trained people who have proven both a dedication to the institution and an understanding of their role in perpetuating core values. I do not mean to suggest that there is anything wrong with this. That is not my point. I have learned to function very well in this system and have been given a position of authority because of it. I have also, to a certain extent, gained critical insight into the purpose of these structures to support our mission. But I am from a generation who heard over and over again that authority can be trusted. That is not true of my children. The church I serve isn't going to stop examining, testing, and educating clergy. They aren't going to throw out their bylaws. They aren't going to stop electing members to serve on committees and empowering the committees to make decisions for the good of the whole. Authority will be identified, prepared, examined, and empowered. This structure will continue to support the missional life of the church I know and love. What are we going to do with those communities of faith that are springing up all over the place, though, who have no relationship to our established and recognized authority? Spiritual guides are calling people into the faith with no training, no examination, and no authorization. Who records the baptisms? Who tests whether or not their ritual meets our established standards? Who examines, lays hands on, and keeps oversight of their pastors? Who tests the boundaries of our recognized orthodoxies and dogmas when these independent freethinkers function without oversight or accountability? Even through the time of the Reformation, the Protestant Church brought with it a need to establish lines of authority for the sake of our missional and sacramental life. Postmoderns just aren't buying into that way of structuring their lives. Ordained clergy may or may not have meaning to them. Even if they do, using ordained clergy as the empowered expert in the room to address the questions of the day will most certainly not have any meaning to them. Becoming a member in order to acquire voting rights and be permitted to serve an elected position of authority will most likely not have any meaning to them. Attaching themselves to denominational structures that have to be funded and obeyed will likely not have any meaning either. All that the church has relied upon to maintain its orthodoxy, to guarantee the safe deliverance of the faith from one generation to another, within accepted limits and boundaries is up for grabs. Churches of the modern era belong to denominations whose clergy have been trained and examined, whose leaders have been called, chosen, elected, appointed by others with recognized authority. We go back generations and can account for baptisms, confirmations, weddings, and deaths. In one generation, all of that is up for grabs. We will struggle mightily with this, but that will be our problem. A whole new way of discovering the life of faith is emerging without the permission of or training required by the established church. Those engaged in this faith exploration aren't asking for permission. This is not an act of defiance. It is simply an awareness that our commitments to these matters consume too much of our time to make them see us as relevant. Their spiritual hungers are both asking for something more fulfilling and finding it in other places. They are not asking us for a fight over this. They don't want to change us. They simply have discovered that what their heart sings for is found somewhere other than in a church that, to their sensitivities, is overcommitted to a reliance on authority. These characteristics of the postmodern world contribute greatly to the decline of the church of modernity. Skepticism about universal truths, a different way of learning, and a built-in mistrust of authority. They are not really on the table for debate. Postmoderns are not interested in arguing with the modern world about who is right and who is wrong. They just happen to live in a world where expectations, assumptions, and perceptions have changed. They also happen to experience the church of the modern world as incapable of making the kind of changes necessary to meet their vastly different spiritual hungers. This has been a quick and albeit very insufficient look at what postmodernity wrought. We can fight it, but we will be tilting at windmills. It is. As I said at the beginning of this chapter, the causes of the church diminishment in membership and financial contributions are many, and their interplay is complex. We have looked here at only 3 of them: a critical decline in the birth rate, the cost of maintaining aging and underutilized buildings, and postmodernity. There's much to be said about what all of this means to the church I love, and in large part, that is what the rest of this book will be about. Here, I simply make the observation that some of our churches are going to die. These and other causes will conspire to close some of our churches. The purpose of this chapter isn't simply to warn the church that some pain is coming. It is a call to think differently about those coming deaths. As I close this chapter, I want to introduce the reader to what I've been calling death with dignity. If we can accept that some churches are going to die, if we can trust the capacity of our faith to sustain us through the grief and the pain that will come every time one does, and if we can shift our strategic approach to these deaths from reactive to proactive, meaning we have to be honest in our assessments with church leaders about their future, then we can have a very different kind of conversation about death. Holy Ghost United Church of Christ was the oldest church in the St. Louis Association. It was clear that they, like many aging white urban churches, were in serious decline. Over 3 years of conversation with their elected and called leadership, I talked with them very seriously about all of their options. We talked about using their existing resources to keep the doors open for as long as possible. We strategized about what could be cut in order to maximize the good use of the remaining assets and to ensure that those who had been members of that church for more than 2 generations could be buried from there. We talked about merging with another church in the St. Louis area. We met with leaders from various churches about what that would look like. We talked about closing the church. This would require actions taken by the leaders to satisfy legal expectations regarding the distribution of the remaining assets held by a not-for-profit corporation. It would also require them to respond to the ongoing need of their shut-ins and hospitalized. We also talked about which churches would be open to accepting the transfers of the remaining members. Although all of these options were painful ones to talk about, this last one was initially the most painful one for them to talk about. I am grateful for a pastor who not only served that church with great love and skill, but who kept the leaders at the table in conversation, even knowing how hard it was going to be for them. Gertrude Schabel was well into her 90s when I met her. She was the grandmother at Holy Ghost for every child who came through there, and for almost 70 years served as a Sunday school teacher. She attended faithfully every gathering of the St. Louis Association. She had a perpetual smile on her face. She was the face of Holy Ghost Church. She was at every meeting I held with the lay leaders of that church and listened with an open heart to everything that was discussed. She prayerfully considered all options, including closing the church. It took 3 years, but Gertrude and the leadership began to focus on what death with dignity might look like. They began to realize that in order to fulfill the missional value of those who built that church for a purpose, it might be their Christian duty to bring this congregational's life to an end, but an end with a purpose, a mission, if you will. I will never forget the Sunday morning we gathered for the last time in the sanctuary of Holy Ghost. With pride and dignity, the moderator stood before the worshipers, many of whom hadn't been back in years and who traveled great distances to say their goodbyes and share cherished memories. The moderator had taken great care to send invitations to many covenant partners beyond the membership of the church. Before we would ritually decommission the church and offer words of closure, she carefully took time and one by one called those invited guests forward. To a children's home built to care for orphans, she gave a check. To a woman's abuse shelter, the same, as well as to the camp run by the conference and to the local Habitat for Humanity affiliate. All in all, about a dozen different missional partners were there to receive what was left of the church's assets. 2 moments from that service are forever indelibly marked in my memory. A representative of the St. Louis Historical Society was there to receive a gift from the church. Not money, something far more precious. As the first German evangelical church in St. Louis was formed for and by and built by the new immigrants of the city, they were the recipients at the founding of a Bible written in the German script and given to them by Kaiser Wilhelm, the first German emperor. His signature and prayerful inscription were penned inside the front cover. With white gloves covering his hands, the representative of the Historical Society came forward to carry that sacred text from the sanctuary to the archives of the city. Then Gertrude stood up, interrupting the ceremony and the decorum of the morning, breaking into this well-choreographed liturgy. She announced proudly, "I've been doing this for almost 70 years now, and I see no reason to stop. Would the children please come with me for their final lesson?" She walked out with a handful of children who had come on that last day of worship. This church chose to die with dignity. I still remember that closing service as one of the most moving and beautiful I have ever had the pleasure of presiding over. I will never forget it. They helped me understand what resurrection life was all about. They died so that a new life could emerge. After closing their accounts and sharing their missional resources with the body of Christ, they kept a small council of leaders together to complete the sale of their property. The assets from that sale were given to the Missouri Mid-South Conference and were dedicated to new church starts. To be sure, there was pain in this, but there was also mature faith that refused to see death as the last word. Their leadership, their act of faith, served both as an inspirational to many and as a source of missional income to a few others. It is now a part of my cache of options when visiting with church leaders who are facing decline and an uncertain future that at some point, and hopefully at the right point, we talk about death with dignity as a viable and a hope-filled option. Not every community is open to having that discussion, but many are. Some of our churches are going to die. Some of them will have an opportunity to approach that sacred moment with dignity. And that's the end of chapter 1.
Wow.
Wow is right. That speaks volumes to what you were just saying in the after statement 2, Janet. Volumes.
It's so true.
Right.
But until you actually hear it, I know we're not all the way through, but until you actually hear it, your thoughts on it are here and there, not always coinciding. This is a very good exercise.
I believe so. I agree.
Yep.
And I'm glad you joined. I'm glad you both joined me.
Same here. Thank you for
Thank
leading
you.
us.
Thank